Inside a bar in Belton City. Roy, Biles, Phil, and Pasha sat around a small round table, guzzling down Southville beer. They didn't talk much as they listened to the drunkards in the next table discussing supernatural powers and mysticism incidents. Before this, I saw that, not only do the Phasacians look like bears, but they could also control fire, throwing them out like javelins. No way. Supernatural powers actually exist. That's because you don't know a thing. I was drunk one day and slept near the cemetery. I saw people from the Church of Evernight appear with a few ghosts out. Yes, ghosts. They floated in the air, and it was terrifying. It was unknown if the drunkards were sharing stories from personal experiences or from hearsay, but the way they described it was with so much agitation that saliva kept flying as their faces flushed red. That's what they're like. They only become more excited after drinking. They always like to brag and be dramatic despite usually being depressed. Biles was a Belton local. Upon seeing this, he explained, ever since the coal mines began to run dry, young people gradually left Belton and headed for Constant and Backland. The atmosphere here has become more and more oppressive, and the city is just declining by the day. This man, who was less than 30 years old, had also been a miner when he was young. He was lucky to survive in the mines, his skin was tanned from all the labor. His exposed muscles weren't too exaggerated, but it gave people the feeling that they were made of steel. As the leader of the group, Roy smiled and said, "What they're saying might be the truth. They're not bragging. The previous war has indeed exposed supernatural powers to many people, especially the soldiers who were directly involved. As long as they're still alive, they will have the corresponding experience. Besides, this also brings about many fortuitous encounters, making it so that people who had zero chance of interacting with supernatural powers or true mysticism to become beyonders." The way he expressed himself was very subtle, as though he was talking about others, but in reality, this was exactly what the four of them had experienced. Biles and Roy had participated in the defense of Belton City before. Phil had once been ransacked by the Phasacians, but he was lucky to not have died. Pasha and her former citizens had seduced and ambushed a few Intis soldiers in the harbor battle. They had witnessed the deaths of many of their friends and obtained supernatural powers due to various reasons. After that, due to the chaos brought about by the war, they either lost contact with their unit, or they avoided it on their own accord without the officials learning about it. Slowly, they got to know each other and became friends with each other due to their common experiences. This time, they had come to Biles's hometown in Belton to seek out any friends and family who might have survived. The reality of this world far exceeds our imaginations. Pasha, who had long dark blonde hair and deep blue eyes, sighed. She was only in her 20s, and she was quite good-looking. However, her face was a little thin, accentuating the protrusion of her cheekbones. This made her look much older than her actual age. In the future, we will lead different lives. Roy, who had the typical Loanese characteristics, raised his cup. To a brand new future. Before he could finish speaking, someone in the bar suddenly screamed. The experienced Roy and company quickly raised their vigilance and cast their gazes over. They saw a young man dressed in ordinary clothes, lying on the ground, rolling back and forth as if he was in extreme pain. Under the dim yellow gas wall lamps, everyone realized that the clothes on the young man's back had been torn open, revealing blood-red streaks. It was as if he had been whipped by a whip. However, no one around him held a whip. The victim had only let out one scream. This was only possible if he had been whipped countless times in an instant. But if that were the case, how could no one notice it? He's holding a wallet. Could this have something to do with the anomaly just now? The thin Phil took several looks and said after some deliberation, "Shall I take a look?" Roy thought for a moment and nodded. "Be careful." Phil grunted and walked over from the small round table. With the help of the crowd, he approached the young man who was now whimpering instead of rolling about. He quietly extended his left hand. His target was the seemingly ordinary leather wallet. Ah! Phil suddenly screamed as he watched his left wrist snap and land on the ground. Blood splattered from the stump onto the faces and bodies of the people around them. The scene instantly froze. The drunken guests were first stunned before swallowing their saliva. Then, they turned around and ran frantically towards the door or to the corners. Something's wrong. No one attacked me. Phil nearly fainted from the pain, but he still forced himself to tell Roy, Biles, and Pasha what he had just experienced. Roy's eyes narrowed as he decisively said, "Let's get out of here first." He then turned his head and said to Biles, "Pick up Phil's hand and preserve it well. I remember that a military doctor I met before is also from Belton. After he got discharged from the army, he came here and opened a private clinic. He can effectively treat this kind of wound." The military doctor named Weber was also a Beyonder. When he participated in the war in the South, he had advanced step by step, obtaining medical skills that surpassed reality. It was said that he could sew up a severed limb and restore it to its former flexible state. "All right." Biles agreed without hesitation. He took a few steps forward, took out a wooden box, picked up Phil's severed hand, and put it in. At the same time, Pasha used the mystical ointment she had bought previously to stop Phil's bleeding, and bandaged it. Soon after, the group of 4 left the bar. After many inquiries, they finally found Weber's clinic with the help of passers-by. The clinic hadn't closed for the day, and the light from the gas lamps inside spread outwards, casting a dim yellow light. Roy politely pulled at the doorbell again and again as he heard the ringing echo inside. However, after a few minutes, no one came to open the door. "He's drunk." Pasha looked at the miserable Phil and made a guess. Roy shook his head. "I remember that Weber isn't one to drink. Other than being more amorous, he doesn't have any bad habits. Perhaps, he's currently," as he spoke, the middle-sized man with a face full of weathered pockmarks pushed the door open and realized that it was not locked. It was ajar. As the door opened, Roy, Biles, and the others saw 2 figures. 2 figures were hanging in the middle of the clinic. Due to the wind blowing in from the outside, they swayed gently. One was a man in his 30s wearing a white coat, while the other was a young lady in a nurse's uniform. Their lower bodies were naked and their eyes were protruding. Their mouths were half open, and their tongues were squeezed out. They were hung on the ceiling by an invisible rope. Their expressions were filled with fear, despair, and blankness. Weber, Roy recognized the dead man. He, along with Pasha, Phil, and Biles, felt a chill run down their spines. They didn't know why something like this had happened, nor did they know what kind of horrors such an unknown might bring. Boom! The sound of a chair being knocked over sounded from the side, jolting the dazed Roy and company. They looked in the direction of the voice and saw a lady carrying a baby standing up in a fluster. She whispered in horror and confusion, they were having an affair. What had this got to do with their encounter? Roy took a deep breath. He felt that he shouldn't stay here for long. He quickly instructed, "Let's go." He didn't ask Pasha to comfort the lady, nor did he attempt to obtain the clinic's disinfectant and bandages. Biles and the others swallowed their saliva with great difficulty, turned around, and warily left the clinic. To Phil, the horror of the unknown had completely suppressed the pain in his left hand. What exactly happened? Phil asked as he turned into another street, asking as his facial muscles winced. "How would I know?" Biles blurted out. He had seemed to lose control of his emotions. Roy looked around and exhaled. "Calm down. This should be a terrifying beyonder matter that has exceeded our imaginations." "Right. All of this is too strange. That can be the only reason." Pasha nodded in agreement. "Then what should we do?" Phil asked anxiously. Roy thought for a moment and said, "Let's try to leave Belton. Also, analyze what happened before and summarize the patterns hidden within." We can't be sure of the anomalies we might encounter later. We can only ensure our own safety after knowing the underlying rules. Right. Biles calmed down and agreed with Roy. They discussed as they walked, gradually having some ideas. Weber was hung for adultery. Before Phil's hand was cut off, he tried to take the wallet. That's a form of theft. Pasha summarized the common point the two incidents had in common. Roy suddenly had an idea. Could it be that they suffered such a situation because they did something illegal? How is that possible? Biles and Phil both replied. As soon as he said that, they suddenly had a corresponding guess, and their expressions turned solemn. Maybe there's an invisible law enforcer. That's the essence of this Beyonder incident, Biles said in thought. Roy tersely acknowledged and said, that's highly possible. Next, we'll take note of our actions. Pasha and the others nodded and walked on the streets cautiously. Not long after, they arrived at the municipal square and saw that there were many people standing around the notice board. Notice? Roy and the others exchanged looks, wondering if it was a warning that the officials had given to the supernatural incidents. Hence, they approached and used the light from the street lamps to look at the notice on the wooden board. There was a piece of white paper stuck in the middle, and beneath it was a piece of yellow paper. It seemed to be an annex. As they quickly scanned through the notice, Roy, Pasha, and the others quickly had their eyes filled with horror. They seemed to understand the source of the matter. After reading the paper, their eyes landed on the yellow paper. All citizens are to arrest foreigners using all possible means. Arrest foreigners. Roy and the others felt their hearts tighten as they instinctively looked at the citizens around the notice board. As if sensing their gazes, the citizens turned around and cast their gaze at them. Under the dim yellow light from the gas lamps, their eyes seemed to glimmer with a strange light. Chapter 1282 Crime. How can someone tell at a glance if another person is a foreigner? How do you distinguish that? Roy forcefully composed himself and pretended to be discussing the yellow paper's contents with his companions. He used the hidden meaning in his words to console Phil and Pasha so that they didn't need to panic. After all, other than Biles, who was a native, the remaining three were also citizens of Lone. They didn't have any southern continent blood in them. Nothing about their facial features stood out. But this is a supernatural incident, Pasha stammered. This couldn't be judged by common sense. Roy's heart froze as he looked at the citizens who were slowly approaching in a deadpan manner. He quickly shouted in a low voice, "Run." As soon as he finished speaking, he turned around and ran towards the nearest street entrance. Pasha and Phil followed closely behind. As a local, Biles tacitly held the rear, covering the surface of his skin with illusory fish scales. Bang! 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 A few citizens raised their dual-barreled hunting guns and fired. Roy, Phil, and Pasha were Beyonders who were relatively good at fighting. While running, they would occasionally change directions or roll forward, successfully dodging the attacks. Following that, under Pasha's guidance, they passed through the streets and escaped their pursuers before hiding in an empty dark corner. What should we do? Phil, who had lost a hand, panted as he asked, from the contents of the notice, we probably won't be able to leave this city. We need to figure out the rules and find a way around them. Although Roy was also very flustered, he still forced himself to calm down and think, lest the morale of the entire squad crumbled. Pasha looked at the wary Biles and asked, has such a notice ever appeared in the past? Biles nodded. Yes, although I rarely had the chance to go to the municipal square, I've been assembled there back when I was recruited into the army. I've seen that notice board. There shouldn't be any problems with the notice board. Perhaps those two pieces of paper are the key. The laws written on them contain mystic intent, Pasha said. Roy immediately expressed his agreement. That's right. Besides, I suspect that the laws have to be made public before they are put into effect. If we can find an opportunity to rip off those two pieces of paper, the corresponding restrictions might disappear. After hearing Roy's words, Pasha, Phil, and Biles fell silent. After a few seconds, Phil's facial muscles twitched as he said, "Let's give it a try. If we continue to be trapped in the city, even if we aren't caught by those citizens, we might be punished for various reasons." Although they were all Beyonders, their sequences weren't high. It wasn't a problem dealing with a few ordinary people, but facing the enmity of an entire city was extremely dangerous. Roy, Biles, and Pasha were more or less people who had been on the battlefield before. They knew that hesitation was the worst action to take in such situations, so they agreed to Phil's suggestion. Under the guidance of the rather experienced hunter, Pasha, the group of 4 made a detour and returned to the municipal square from another street. At this moment, the residents who were surrounding the notice were no longer there. It was as if they were searching the entire city for foreigners. When they saw the notice board that stood silently in the middle of 2 gas lamps, Roy and company carefully approached it, ready to escape at any moment. After approaching the target, Roy suddenly thought of a question. He hurriedly lowered his voice and asked, "Is destroying the notice considered an illegal act?" In theory, yes. Pasha was taken aback. They then cast their gaze at the notice board and scanned through the list of crimes stipulated by the third law. 8. Destroying public property. It really exists. Biles blurted out. Phil, whose face had turned pale due to the blood loss, turned paler. After some thought, he said, "What kind of punishment does destroying public property entail?" This wasn't a very serious crime, and the corresponding punishment should be relatively lenient. If that was the case, Phil decided to take the risk to tear the notice and end this horrifying, bizarre event. First-timers get whipped. Just as Roy, Pasha, and Biles were pondering over the answer, a voice sounded from behind them. The 4 turned around in shock and saw a young man in a black robe and a tall hat. He looked ordinary. The man continued, "A repeated offense is to have one's hand lopped off. I'm not sure what happens after that." "How do you know that?" Fully alert, Roy frowned as he gripped his concealed dagger. The young man smiled and said, "I've tried. It's useless. The notice gets restored very quickly." "So, you've been whipped?" Pasha asked in enlightenment. "Yes." The young man nodded with a relaxed expression. "However, because I also committed fraud, I was later punished with having my hand lopped off." "Fraud?" Biles asked, puzzled. The young man chuckled and replied, "To put it simply, I didn't personally destroy the notice. Instead, I created a dummy to do it." The one who was whipped was also the dummy. As he spoke, he raised his right arm. Like Phil, his wrist was cut neatly. His stump was ghastly white and red, as though he was still bleeding. Suddenly, the stump's flesh squirmed and twisted, as transparent worms crawled out. They intertwined with each other and formed a new hand. During this process, Roy and the others didn't feel the slightest bit of fear. This was because the moment they saw those worms which had details they couldn't discern, their thoughts were thrown in a mess. Random thoughts ran through their minds as they found it difficult to control their emotions. After the palm was covered with skin and became normal, the Beyonders recovered. They retreated a few steps in shock, surprise, and fear. The scene just now had exceeded their understanding. "By the way, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a wandering magician." The person who had committed a fraud and a case of destruction of public property was none other than Klein. He swept a glance at the 4 Beyonders and said with a smile, "My best magic trick is to grant someone's wishes. Do you have a wish you would like granted?" Upon hearing this question, Roy's spirits rose as he asked with hope, "Can you take us away from Belton?" "Of course, I'll do my best to do this, but not now." Klein gave his promise. Then, he looked at the handless Phil. "He just said his wish. What's yours?" "Let my hand recover," Phil probed. "All right." Klein cast his gaze at Biles. Take out his hand. After hesitating for a moment, Biles took out the wooden box as per the mysterious man's instructions and returned the hand inside to Phil. Come here, Klein said with a smile. Phil mustered his courage and walked over with his severed hand. Remove the bandages, Klein continued to instruct. Place the severed arm in its original spot. Let me remind you, don't have it reversed. Otherwise, you'll have to chop it off again and repeat the process. Seeing how confident the other party was, Phil felt a little more confident. He quickly pulled off the bandage that had been stuck to his wound with a twisted expression as he hissed. After placing his severed hand at the stump, Klein took out a piece of white paper and approached. Then, he reached out to wipe the wound. Silently, the piece of paper split into two while Phil felt the pain disappear. He quickly looked down and saw that his left wrist was perfectly intact. He couldn't even tell that he had been hurt before. Phil subconsciously moved his fingers and realized that he didn't lose any of his motor skills at all. Your wish has been granted. Klein took 2 steps back and smiled. Thank you, Phil replied in a daze. Klein looked at the other 2 Beyonders. What's your wish? Upon seeing that Phil's wish had really been fulfilled, Biles immediately stepped forward and said, I want to know where my family is. Klein flicked his left arm and took out a silver mirror with ancient patterns. He lowered his head and said with a smile, what is the answer to that question? The surface of the mirror shimmered with aqueous light as silver words appeared one after another. Belton Glorin Cemetery. Upon seeing this, Biles, who had his neck craned, felt his heart sink as he couldn't help but feel a strong sense of sorrow and disappointment. In the next second, new silver words appeared from the aqueous light. S. Gravekeeper's Hut. This means that. Biles felt his sorrow turn to happiness as he sincerely said, thank you. As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly thought of 2 questions. How many people could live in the graveyard? How many gravekeepers could there be? His family members definitely numbered more than 2 or 3. Biles's expression turned oscillated between gloom and joy before he fell silent. As a result, he didn't see the question posed by the silver mirror. Great Master, did I answer kindly enough? Yes. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he cast his gaze at the remaining lady. Pasha thought for 2 seconds and said, my wish is for you to protect us until we leave Belton alive. She realized that Roy's wish was problematic because they might not necessarily leave Belton alive. Smart. Klein praised with a smile. Your wish will be granted. Then what price do we have to pay? I'm referring to the payment for watching your magic. Pasha hurriedly asked. Your wishes are the price, Klein replied briefly before asking thoughtfully, if you know certain things are fake, but if you are willing to subjectively use them, it shouldn't be considered fraud, right? When Roy and company heard this, they were puzzled. After pondering for a moment, they shook their heads and said, definitely not. This is actually a game between 2 parties. A voluntary action that has a clear understanding of the actions is definitely not a scam. There's no doubt about it. After hearing their answers, Klein smiled. Very good. This is what the average person will think. As he spoke, he grabbed a few times with his right hand, dragging out a woman in a simple robe with black long hair. It was the historical void projection of the Evernight Cloister's matron, Ariana. Klein looked around and saw nothing unusual. He smiled at the projection and said, Madam, what exactly happened? Ariana's eyes darted about slightly, turning deep and quiet instantly. It made one feel a sense of serenity from the bottom of their hearts. She calmly spoke, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, escaped. I'm tracking him. Ariana paused and said, after I came to Belton, I received new information. According to our intelligence, Larian took away a sealed artifact when he escaped. 0-02. Chapter 1283 Gradually Deepening 0-02. Klein inwardly repeated the serial number, feeling that the problem might be more troublesome than he had expected. Although it couldn't be said that 0-02 was definitely more terrifying than 0-05, since the true essence of the magic wishing lamp was that of a sealed outer deity, an entity far stronger than the present true deities, he could definitely destroy this world or even this solar system if not for the restrictions of the outer shell. However, the smaller the number meant that 0-02 was likely more dangerous and more difficult to seal than 0-05 in most cases. At the end of the fourth epoch, the 7 churches had serialized the batch of grade 0 sealed artifacts to 2-digit numbers. Being only second to 0-01, it's totally possible to imagine how terrifying 0-02 is. However, the god of combat didn't seem to make use of this sealed artifact in the Battle of Gods. Was it not suitable for direct combat, or was it too dangerous? It didn't distinguish between friend and foe. Thoughts ran through Klein's mind. His expression gradually turned serious. "Ma'am, what do you know about 0-02? Ariana slowly shook her head and said, "When the various churches inform each other of the grade 0 and grade 1 sealed artifacts, they only mention the serial numbers." "That's right. The information regarding a grade 0 sealed artifact is strictly confidential internally to a church. As part of the brass, they usually have to be in charge of a particular grade 0 sealed artifact before they can come into contact with any related information. Furthermore, there's a high chance that the corresponding memories will be erased after everything is over. This is, on the one hand, to prevent important information from leaking, and on the other hand, there's the fact that just knowing about grade 0 sealed artifacts in most cases can result in danger, or cause the seal to be ineffective." Klein asked in thought, didn't the church already take over the Church of the God of Combat? That way, they could have obtained all the files on 0-02. Ariana looked at the nearby Roy and company and said, "Larian destroyed all files regarding the grade 0 sealed artifacts before escaping. Impressive. Such an abnormally cautious fellow is really annoying." Klein thought and said, "What comments does the goddess have of 0-02? From his point of view, the Evernight goddess and the god of combat were existences from the same period. Furthermore, she was in control of the concealment authority. The goddess had a high chance of understanding the situation that the latter grasped. In addition, it was impossible for the sealed artifacts at the level of 0-02 not to leave any traces in history. They might have created many disasters, so they were no stranger to high-level figures of that era." Ariana seemed to have recalled the situation from a long time ago. She stated without any pause, "In the past revelation, the goddess called 0-02 the Book of Rules." Book of Rules. That's even more terrifying. Klein's eyes narrowed as he made plenty of connections. In his past life, he was a gaming enthusiast who played a broad genre of games despite not being too obsessed. He wasn't unfamiliar with the term Book of Rules at all. At this moment, Ariana added, "The fact that you happen to be in Belton City might reveal some of the characteristics of 0-02. Yes, it's quite normal for Ma'am Ariana to encounter such an anomaly while tracking the chief shepherd, Larian, to Belton, but for me to also be here, it's too much of a coincidence." In mysticism, excessive coincidences often mean that there's something wrong. Is someone setting me up, or is it the effect of the law of beyonder characteristic convergence? Based on the present situation, the setup doesn't seem targeted, and how I'm already the owner of Sapphira Castle, I can more or less sense something abnormal. If it's the law of beyonder characteristic convergence, eliminating the exiled Mr. Dorr and the Antigonus ancestor who is sealed in the foggy town, the only ones that can influence me to this extent are Zeradal and Amon. However, I've always been deliberately avoiding Zeradal. Amon's true body should be under the true creator's pursuit. If it's just an avatar, it's impossible for it to produce such a powerful convergence effect. Yes, there's another possibility. The law of convergence between Sphirot. 0-02 attracted Sapphira Castle, causing me to coincidentally come to Belton today. If that's the case, even if 0-02 isn't a Sapphira, it's definitely related to 1. Klein, who had already suspected something, suddenly thought of a lot. He had a vague grasp of 0-02. He thought for a moment and said, from the development of the situation, the rules are gradually becoming stricter. That piece of yellow paper is evidence. Does this mean that the extent of 0-02's coming to life or the degree of reawakening is becoming deeper? Ariana nodded serenely and said, that's right. We have to find it before something happens, and also try to seal it. That's why it's best we split up and expand the search radius, saving as much time as possible. Klein had no objections to this. After some thought, he said, Ma'am, you've told me so much. Isn't this considered leaking secrets? No. Ariana gave a rather clear answer. Leaking secrets refers to informing the outside world of the anomaly in Belton via any way. This has cut off any physical connection between us and the outside world. That's fine. At least, there's no need to worry about any problems with our usual conversations. In short, it's fine if we don't curse. Klein silently heaved a sigh of relief and asked, the Nighthawks and mandated punishers here will abide by the rules on the notice? Yes. Ariana gave an affirmative answer before her figure faded away and disappeared. After watching the matron of the Evernight cloister leave, Klein quickly sorted out the information he had just obtained and gained some understanding of the possible developments that were to come. Combat wasn't the main point. The crux of the problem was whether he could find 0-02 in time and think of a way to seal it. During this process, what they would face as foreigners would become more and more complicated. They would find it increasingly difficult to abide by the rules and the citizens that were controlled. With this in mind, Klein cast his gaze to Roy and company not far away. He asked with a smile, what are your thoughts on what you just heard? Roy exchanged looks with Pasha and said, we don't know what a Grade 0 sealed artifact is, but we can guess that 0-02 is a very terrifying item. It can set the rules and even change reality to a certain extent. Furthermore, this anomaly seems to change as time passes. Also, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat should be a very powerful beyonder. Klein gently clapped his hands and smiled. That's about it. If we don't work hard and hope to avoid danger by hiding, then there will be more and more things that we need to take note of. If we aren't careful, we might commit a crime. Perhaps in the end, we will be executed on the spot because we stepped out the door with our left foot first. His words left Pasha, Biles, and the others in a panic. It was indeed funny to hear the possible developments, but on second thought, they could sense the extreme horror hidden within. A few seconds later, Pasha said with a solemn expression, furthermore, the citizens can use any means to deal with us, but we are unable to fight back. This is because killing and voluntarily causing harm are very serious crimes. We can try to deceive their senses, but we can't use it too many times, Klein said casually. What we need to do now is to quickly summarize the rules that 0-02 follows. That way, we can find it and seal it before it comes to life or awakens to gain true intelligence. What are your thoughts? Marauder Phil thought for a moment and probed, it doesn't seem capable of attacking us directly. It can only punish us when we violate the rules and commit crimes. Klein snapped his fingers and said, that's right. I can summarize this law for now, 0-02 cannot punish those who do not commit crimes. Biles blurted out, but it can make the citizens arrest foreigners. Foreigners aren't considered criminals. This does contradict the previous law from before, Klein replied with a smile. However, in history, many cities have come up with laws that include discrimination and the expulsion of foreigners in the different stages of their development. Did you decipher any deeper laws from this matter? The four Beyonders frowned one after another, unsure what the powerful magician opposite them was trying to express. After a brief silence, Pasha, who thought of the question he had asked, asking whether a particular action was considered fraud, hesitated and said, "The rules issued by 0-02 must match the public's understanding and be acknowledged to a certain extent." "That's a good idea," Klein praised. "This is a guess thanks to the law regarding the arrest of foreigners. It has been verified from your previous feedback, so we can temporarily list it as its second law. This can help us determine which actions are crimes and which aren't." Seeing Pasha receive the praise of the powerful magician Weiss, Roy hurriedly added, "It will constantly increase the number of laws, reaching a certain level of complexity, thereby limiting us. No matter what we do, we will be punished. Yes, on the basis of arresting foreigners, clauses such as the trespassing of private property and the prohibition of defecation or urination in public will make life harder for us with the passage of time." Just as Klein nodded in agreement, his spiritual perception was triggered. He instinctively raised his head and looked at the notice board. He realized that a goatskin parchment had appeared on it at some point in time. "Curfew order." This, Pasha and the others also noticed this change and their eyes widened. It was already late at night. If they stayed outside for some time, they would violate the curfew and suffer some punishment. Then, the punishment would worsen each time until they were sentenced to death. "Let's go. We haven't got much time." Klein pressed down his tall hat and said with a smile, "Our target is most likely a book. It might still be with the chief shepherd, or it might have already been hidden somewhere. My intuition tells me that it might be the latter. This is because, to anyone, that item is too dangerous, and it will only become more dangerous. Of course, the premise is that the chief shepherd hasn't gone crazy, only using 0-02 to create a chance to escape pursuit. By the way, I forgot to tell you that the chief shepherd is a grounded angel." "Angel?" Roy, Pasha, and the others, who had just begun to move, froze. Chapter 1284 Limitation Loophole. In the present era of this world, belief in a deity was common. The difference was which deity they believed in. Therefore, even if Roy, Pasha, and company didn't understand the meaning of angels and mysticism, they had more or less heard of legends about angels from the priests, bishops, and seniors around them. They knew that they were the servants of deities, and were powerful creatures that were qualified to be addressed as him or her. Every action of theirs could create miracles. They were definitely not something ordinary people could compare with. In the hearts of these four beyonders, angels were of a whole different level, holy spirits of another world. Under normal circumstances, they lived in the divine kingdoms and wouldn't descend into the real world. They could be treated as true legends without considering the meaning they had in reality. Just like the battles they had experienced in the past, although they would occasionally encounter beyonders today who struck terror in their hearts, like today, them being angels was the last thing on their mind. The two weren't on the same level. But today, a wandering and mysterious magician had informed them that the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat was an angel who walked the land. Phil and the others believed in the mysterious gentleman, who had shown all kinds of amazing feats, from the bottom of their hearts. Firstly, he had granted their wishes and was friendly enough. Secondly, they didn't believe that they were qualified enough to be deceived in such matters. To them, the chief shepherd was an angel or an abnormally powerful beyonder. In essence, there was no difference between the two. The reality of this world far exceeds our imaginations. The words that Pasha often said flashed through her mind. Roy made further connections. He remembered that the lady, whom Mr. Magician had invited from thin air, mentioned that she was pursuing the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat. Furthermore, she seemed to be qualified to see the Evernight goddess's revelation. The only person who can track an angel is probably another angel. With Mr. Magician's performance in front of that lady, his level can't be that much lower. Roy hurriedly retracted his gaze from Klein's back and didn't dare to look at him directly. He looked left and right and realized that Phil had come to a similar guess as well. A complicated feeling emerged from his pale face, one that was a result of his blood loss. Biles held his breath and only spoke after a few seconds. No wonder there's such an inexplicable change in Belton. It's not the time to feel poignant about this. Let's hurry up and leave. The curfew is about to take effect, Klein reminded with a smile without any signs of nervousness. Pasha quickly looked at the notice board and imprinted the contents into a brand in her mind. From 8 at night to 8 in the morning. Free movement and assembling in the streets are forbidden. Where should we go? She blurted out. Under the double restrictions of the curfew and the no trespassing clause, it appeared as though they could only await punishment. Klein smiled and said, only movement and assembly in the streets are forbidden. As he spoke, he pointed at a nearby manhole which led to the sewers. Biles's eyes lit up. Yes, it didn't say that we can't pass through the sewers. When curfews were in place previously, the tramps hid in the sewers or abandoned buildings. Roy and the others didn't hesitate any longer. They immediately went forward and used the advantage of their strength to push open the manhole cover and climbed into the sewers. In the pitch-black darkness, a dim yellow light lit up as a lantern appeared in Klein's hand. As they followed the mystical magician, Phil said thoughtfully, we can head to a hotel next. Biles is a local. He won't be attacked, so he can get a room. Then, we can climb through the window and enter from the outside. As we have gotten permission from the owner, we wouldn't be considered as trespassing on private property. In that case, we can stay until dawn and wait for the curfew to end. It's a very interesting idea, but our goal isn't to survive until dawn, Klein replied with a smile as he walked ahead of them with the lantern in hand. Roy nodded and said, if we don't do anything and stay in the hotel, the rules will increase one by one, becoming so detailed that guests aren't allowed to stay in hotel rooms. Actually, the most interesting thing about that proposal isn't the finding of loopholes to the restrictions, but that it reminded me of something. Klein turned his body slightly and looked at Biles. As a local from Belton, he actually didn't attempt to capture us foreigners. In other words, he wasn't affected by the Yellow Paper's orders. This. Pasha and the others all turned warily to look at Biles, clearly showing suspicion on their faces. Their encounter earlier had made them certain that the citizens of Belton City had lost their minds in the foreigner arresting affair. I don't know why either, Biles also murmured in confusion. Are you still a Belton citizen? Klein asked casually as he slowly walked in the damp and smelly sewer. Biles followed behind him and answered with some certainty, of course. Klein thought and asked, on the one hand, you are a citizen of Belton. On the other hand, you are a standard foreigner. Two of your attributes overlap, causing a contradiction. Under that order, you will neither be attacked, nor will you have your rationality affected. If we can create such a contradiction, does it mean we will be able to escape the limitations of the rules? Phil asked spiritedly. Pasha shook her head. But such a contradiction is very hard to create. At least I can't think of any possibility right now. She suddenly paused and hesitated before saying, the most important thing is that we're far away from the notice board. We don't know what other laws will follow. We have no way of avoiding them. When that happened, they wouldn't dare to do anything. Klein smiled and said, don't worry. This mirror can help us see the new content on the notice board. He casually displayed the magic mirror that had slipped into his left palm. Pasha heaved a sigh of relief and asked curiously, isn't this a crime of peeping? On the surface of the silver mirror, words that resembled dripping blood appeared, the way I look at the notice board is like looking at the sun in the day. There's no need to peep. Klein retracted his magic mirror and added with a smile, besides, this is just an item. How can it commit a crime? That really makes sense. Biles and Phil couldn't help but nod. After Roy figured it out, he exhaled and asked, next, the most important thing is to find that item, but we don't have any clues. As a book, it can be anywhere. We can only carpet search the entire city, but we clearly lack the time to do that. Indeed, we don't know where 0-02 is. We don't even have any clues, but there's an existence that knows the answer very clearly, Klein replied leisurely as he heard the footsteps echoing in the sewers. Pasha's heart stirred. You mean that chief shepherd? Klein smiled and nodded. 0-02 is either in his hands, or it has been hidden by him somewhere. And a book is clearly unable to move on its own. This isn't something that the current rules can help it achieve. But how do we find that chief shepherd? Biles blurted out. Perhaps it was because the magical Mr. Magician was by his side, he wasn't that afraid of searching for the grounded angel. Klein calmly held the lantern and said, as long as 0-02 doesn't provide the chief shepherd immunity, he, too, would have to abide by the laws on the notice. He was originally from Faysac, so he is undoubtedly not a citizen of Belton. He is unable to enjoy the treatment of the locals. Similarly, although he is an angel from elsewhere and not a foreigner in the narrow sense of the word, he isn't human, he too will be pursued by the citizens. This can be confirmed. In short, that chief shepherd has to abide by the curfew and not trespass private residences. He can't hide in a public area that isn't open to the public at night. At the same time, as a fugitive, he likely doesn't have companions who have dual traits like Biles. Tell me, where do you think he will be? Roy's eyes darted around as he gave several answers: sewers, cemetery, cathedral before midnight, abandoned buildings. You can't enter the cemetery at night. The abandoned buildings are owned by someone or some group by virtue of its property rights, Pasha reminded. Yes. Once the sewers are restricted, we will head to the cathedral to search for the chief shepherd or wait for him, Klein said in a relaxed tone as though he was deciding on a trivial matter. Roy, Phil, and the others were stunned. They hadn't expected that they would be able to lock onto their target so easily. It just took a few words of discussion to expose an angel's whereabouts. However, there are quite a few cathedrals in Belton. We have to act in concert to save time. Also, the cathedral might be able to forcefully resist the punishment by relying on his level as an angel and his powers. With that said, Klein lowered his head and said to the magic mirror in his hand, Harads, monitor the entire city and pay attention to any anomalies. After giving his instructions to the mirror, Klein once again dragged Ma'am Ariana out of the fog of history and asked her to be in charge of the cathedrals of the Church of Evernight. After doing so, he turned around and said to Roy, Pasha, and company, if we still can't find the chief shepherd after all that is done, it means that he has either left Belton, leaving 0-02 behind to attack the enemy, or he has already gained control of 0-02 to a certain extent. In short, we can proceed by means of elimination for now. Roy and company nodded in unison as they continued following Klein in the sewers. After a few minutes, the ancient silver mirror reflected a scene. On the signboard, there was another piece of paper with new rules. Because of municipal maintenance works, no living being is allowed to enter the sewers from now on. Content is being added at an increasing rate. Klein frowned indiscernibly as he muttered to himself before taking out a human-skinned glove. Immediately after, he gestured for Pasha and the others to hold hands. Then, he grabbed one of them by the shoulder and led them out of the sewers to teleport to the nearest storm cathedral. During this process, the four Beyonders first saw the rats and cockroaches in the sewers twitching as they died one after another. Following that, they were attracted by the strange and abstract spirit world, as though they had suffered some sort of catharsis at the mental level. Chapter 1285 Forget about leaving, all of you. Although there weren't many supplicants in the Storm Cathedral in the evening, Klein chose to appear on a corridor that led to the garden so as to avoid conflict. How magical, Pasha muttered to herself as she looked at the settling surroundings. Roy suppressed his emotions and looked around. If that chief shepherd comes to the cathedral to tide over the curfew, he could be somewhere like this. If one isn't worried about accumulating the number of crimes they commit, an angel has too many ways to fool the average person, Klein said casually. I'll send you to the other cathedrals later. Try to stay in places with glass windows and mirrors. Once you discover any outsiders that might be from Faysac, find an opportunity to draw a symbol, before he could finish his sentence, his head suddenly turned as he looked at the door leading to the garden in the prayer hall. A figure over 6 meters tall slowly walked out. He was wearing a long black robe with white edges, one completely filled with his bulging muscles. This was an old, white-bearded man wearing a square hat. His eyes were pale blue, and he had few wrinkles. He had an aura of superciliousness. The chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian. Without needing to identify the figure, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that the person opposite him was an angel, the reason for coming to the cathedral. Larian glanced at him and said in surprise, "It's not Ariana." He immediately restrained his expression and said rather indifferently, "Appears to be her helper. You can tell her that I've reached an agreement with 0-02, which has come alive to a certain degree. I'll give up sealing it in exchange for permission to leave. And y'all will stay here, enduring the changes in the rules and the increasingly stricter laws until y'all are completely dead." The chief shepherd didn't seem to be worried that Klein would stop him at all. This was because when he spoke, his body was rapidly aging. The surface of his skin quickly became covered in wrinkles, with aging spots appearing on it, dripping with a rotting liquid. In just a few blinks of an eye, Larian looked as though he was about to evaporate into thin air from his aging. Then, he turned into a pool of rotten liquid that completely evaporated. The impact of this scene sent shivers down Biles and company's spines. They felt as if their minds were about to go haywire and that their emotions were about to collapse. This was just like the countless tiny worms that had crawled out from the wound on Mr. Magician's wrist when he reformed his hand. It was just as terrifying and harrowing. A strange ability, it has something to do with Twilight. Klein didn't have any intention of stopping Larian. He only nodded in thought. In the spirit world corresponding to Belton, Larian's figure appeared and returned to normal. Right on the heels of that, as though he could control spirit world creatures, he passed through an invisible barrier and escaped the many restrictions of Belton City. But just as Larian was about to begin tearing through space, everything suddenly darkened and he saw a seamless patch of dark cloth. It was like a wall that blocked Larian's path. Larian cautiously stopped his actions, looked up at the infinitely high area where the 7 pure lights were. However, he could only see an illusory curtain hanging down from it, enveloping the spirit world of the area corresponding to Belton, isolating it and creating an independent world. At the same time, Larian's intuition as a demon hunter had told him that the barrier formed by the curtain was extremely strong and difficult to break through. He needed to spend a lot of time and effort to do so. To this chief shepherd, what was happening had a strange comical feeling, making him unable to contain his rising anger. This was akin to him finally finding the key to a secret chamber after countless hardships. Just when he had the chance to open the door and leave before others could, he was surprised to find that there was an additional lock on the chamber's door, a rather sturdy lock. It lacks a sense of realism. It's a projection from the historical void. It's fraud. No, it's outside of Belton City, out of the law's jurisdiction. This historical projection should have existed here a long time ago. It can't last more than 2 minutes, so it will dissipate on its own. Larian quickly regained his composure, allowing his anchors and inclination towards madness to once again form a balance. In the corridor of the Storm Cathedral, Roy and company finally recovered. They turned their heads to look at Mr. Magician, who was in no way inferior to the angel from before. Pasha hesitated for a moment before saying fearfully, He seems to have escaped. This way, they wouldn't be able to obtain any information about 0-02's location. Relying on a carpet search would be too late. Furthermore, no one present knew what the terrifying sealed artifact looked like. Describing it as a book made it too wide a scope. I can only think of other solutions, Klein replied with a smile. Do you have any suggestions? He had been waiting for Larian to return and negotiate with him, but he realized that the chief shepherd would rather wait in the spirit world for the curtain historical projection to disappear. And although he could enter the spirit world as well, he was unable to break through the strange barrier created after 0-02's law changing. As he spoke, Klein seriously considered other solutions and made a few worms of spirit control his body. He spoke to the Beyonders beside him in an attempt to find inspiration through their discussion. We should take the initiative to create a contradiction that's similar to what happened to Biles so that we'll be in a relatively safe state. Only by doing so will we be able to begin our search. Phil brought up the idea that he had previously had. Pasha shook her head. But if we use this kind of contradiction to do something, 0-02 will definitely add new rules to resolve the corresponding problems. But this can still buy us some time, Phil emphasized. That is something that can be done, Roy agreed, and added, but our focus should be on finding 0-02. Perhaps we can create some contradiction that will make it expose its location. As for what kind of contradiction could achieve such an effect or how to create it, he hadn't come up with an idea. In the event of a contradiction, new rules will be added to resolve it. Klein wore a smile as he listened silently. Sparks flew as his thoughts crashed in his mind. At that moment, aqueous light appeared on the surface of the magic mirror in his hand as silver words appeared. Pasha, do you want to know what the new content on the notice board is? The mirror directly asked me. Why did it ask me directly? Pasha was taken aback for a moment before she hurriedly nodded and answered, yes. The aqueous light in the silver mirror quickly returned and presented a scene of the notice board. There were two new rules. In compliance with the curfew order, the various cathedrals will shut down early, all hotels shall only accommodate guests who have registered their identities. Phil panicked. Where do we go now? He had no idea how he, Roy, and Pasha could escape the punishment. Roy and Pasha exchanged looks as various thoughts surged through their minds, but none of them were viable. At this moment, Klein, who had been maintaining his silence, smiled and cast his gaze at Biles. Where's your house in Belton? A rental apartment on 18, Maple Street, but that apartment has already collapsed from the blast of an artillery shell, Biles answered, slightly perplexed. Klein smiled and said, you can make a wish to return your house to its original state. I'll grant it. Can that be done? Although the magical magician had healed Phil's severed hand with unbelievable powers, Biles still felt that it would be much more difficult to restore a collapsed house to its original state. After all, Dr. Weber, the military doctor who Roy mentioned, was capable of doing that. Of course. Klein smiled and reminded him. Make haste. At that moment, the supplicants in the cathedral were leaving one after another. Biles didn't dare to delay any further as he immediately said, I wish that my house will return to its original state. All right. Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. Your wish has come true. While Roy and company were in a daze, Klein activated teleport once again and brought them to 18, Maple Street. He stopped outside a two-bedroom room. Biles stared blankly at the familiar wooden door in front of him. Subconsciously, he reached out his right hand and pushed it open. The cupboard, gas stove, bunk bed, wooden table covered in oil, and the messy old newspapers strewn everywhere were reflected in his eyes as his eyes immediately moistened. Before the war broke out, he often saw his mother busying herself around the coal stove when he came back from the mines. His father and brother either made use of the time to do some repairs or helped to handle the spoiled parts of the fruit and vegetables. They did some of the work that could be taken home. His young niece learned the alphabet from old newspapers under the guidance of her mother while she put together matchstick boxes. Although such a life was tough and didn't have any ability to avoid risks, it was still a wonderful memory for Biles. It was many times better than the dark mine paths, heavy oars, and the whipping from the supervisors. But now, even this tiny bit of beauty was completely destroyed. Aren't you going to invite us in? Phil stood at the door, not daring to trespass on the private property. After snapping back to his senses, Biles hurriedly said, "Please come on in." After entering the unoccupied house, Klein pulled a chair that could break at any moment and sat down. He then fell silent. Roy, Pasha, and the others did not dare to disturb the gentleman as they waited quietly by his side. After 20 to 30 seconds, Klein suddenly looked around and said with a smile, "I have an idea that requires verification. Who wants to work with me on this?" "I'll do it," Roy replied without hesitation. Klein smiled and replied, afterward, "Don't truthfully answer the questions. I'm looking for the loopholes hidden in 0-02's rules." Roy nodded and said, "That wouldn't be an issue." Klein immediately took out the magic mirror and said to Roy, "Ask it a question." Roy thought for a moment and said, "Where can I find my next potion?" A scene appeared on the surface of the silver mirror. It was the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, who was pacing around the spirit world. Roy's expression instantly stiffened. Then, he heard Mr. Magician say, "It's your turn to answer its question. Remember, don't give it the correct answer." Roy hurriedly reined in his thoughts and looked back at the mirror. He saw that the mirror had already transformed into Mr. Magician himself, and a few more lines of blood-like text appeared. "Who did you give your first time to?" Roy instantly recalled the past as his face flushed red. Then, he answered according to Mr. Magician's instructions, "I'm not sure." A lie. The blood-colored text on the silver mirror instantly condensed into the terrifying words. "Pa!" A bolt of lightning appeared out of nowhere and struck Roy. Roy convulsed in pain as his body was charred black. His hair stood on end, but his life wasn't truly in danger. Biles, Pasha, and Phil were all startled, unsure what had just happened. At this moment, Klein looked around and smiled. "Look, the mirror didn't get punished for voluntarily causing harm. A real opportunity lies in here." Chapter 1286 New Applications of Old Methods. A real opportunity. Pasha, Biles, and Phil were delighted to hear this. It was as if they had finally seen the light after searching for a long time in the dark night. "What kind of opportunity?" Roy blurted out from his dazed state. Klein wasn't in a rush. He smiled and said, "Did you guys not notice? There is no clear indication on the notice of who the enforcer is." As a keyboard warrior in the past, Klein had always claimed to be a jack of all trades. Furthermore, he had interacted with many lawyers in his life and had an Earl of the Fallen marionette before. He had the basic foundation needed when it came to the law and rules. That's right, the announcement only mentioned a new console, and it's not clear who the enforcer is. We encountered an invisible justiciar previously. Pasha and the others revealed a thoughtful expression. Upon seeing this, Klein reached out his hand and stroked the surface of the magic mirror as though he was combing an animal. Under normal circumstances, everyone has tacitly acknowledged that the police and the authorities responsible for dealing with supernatural cases enforce the law. This is confirmed through a series of legal documents or the corresponding public knowledge. But this time, the rules haven't reached such an airtight level. If we say that the rules are built on a blank slate composed of the original laws, directives, and rules, then we should have seen the police, the Nighthawks, or the mandated punishers when we committed crimes, but that's not the case. In other words, the corresponding enforcer is indeed vague. Pasha, who was the most knowledgeable among the four Beyonders, thought for a moment before saying, perhaps, the law enforcer is an abstract concept. Or perhaps it is tacitly equivalent to the new console. The latter isn't clear either. It doesn't make it clear who the new console is. This way, it can be anyone. The former isn't obliged to make it known, Klein simply replied. Phil frowned and said, but we can't enforce the law like the citizens. The corresponding authority is determined by eliminating groups via labels, Klein explained with a smile. Foreigners are targets of ostracization and pursuit, so they obviously lack the required law enforcement rights. As for the citizens, they only have it when dealing with foreigners. This is confirmed through the notice. Without waiting for Roy and Biles to speak, Klein continued, "So, I just used the contradiction hidden in this matter to get Roy to test it. The result is exactly as I predicted. First of all, the magic mirror isn't a foreign living being, neither is it a local. It's just an item with a certain level of intelligence. It cannot be placed into any particular group. This way, in a situation where the law enforcer isn't clear, those who aren't part of the elimination process have the right to enforce the law. Secondly, it had punished a foreigner. Those notices imply that all who deal with foreigners are law enforcers. Finally, the magic mirror itself has the rules of punishment. Before this rule is announced to be illegal, it has the right to punish others. Based on the 3 points above, I believe that 0-02 should be in a lot of conflict right now. Next, it will definitely issue a new law to clearly determine the main body of law enforcement, to mend the loopholes in this area. Once the main body of the law enforcement is revealed, it will contain a lot of information. It will help us lock onto the target. If 0-02 uses a method of adding prohibitions, it will definitely restrict itself, as it shares the same attributes as the mirror. This is definitely not its first choice. At that moment, Roy, Pasha, and the others, who were listening to Klein's recount, suddenly had the feeling that he was a knowledgeable and highly intelligent person. Could it be that Mr. Magician is a wise man who likes to travel among the commoners in legends? The 4 Beyonders each made similar but different guesses. At this moment, the magic mirror in Klein's hand emitted a misty aqueous light. Amidst the aqueous light, the silver mirror's surface showed the notice board. 2 more lines appeared on the bottom of the original piece of paper. All law enforcement must be carried out by the Trunsoist Brass Book or the group it authorizes. Any private rules can't surpass the official decree. Trunsoist Brass Book. This is the full name of 0-02. The opportunity is here. Klein's expression turned serious as he entered cogitation. He had forced 0-02 to clarify the main law enforcement to obtain more information so as to further understand the situation of the terrifying sealed artifact. And based on Klein's deduction, 0-02 was more or less related to a particular Sapphira, just like how he was back when he had yet to become the owner of Sapphira Castle. Therefore, furthering his understanding of it would inevitably result in reverse corruption, thereby establishing a certain connection. To a certain extent, the Sapphira was equivalent to a great old one, outer deity, or the cosmos. Back then, Klein had used such mysticism knowledge to lock onto the location of dark demonic wolf Kotar. Now, he was using it in the opposite direction. From his point of view, 0-02 was definitely more corrupted by a Sapphira than him. After all, sealed artifacts were in a state of having lost control. This was why they needed to be sealed. Under such circumstances, further understanding of 0-02 would result in corruption. The reality proved Klein's hypothesis. And it was also because of this danger that he didn't show the new content presented by Rhodes to the 4 Beyonders. In cogitation, Klein quickly sensed that he had an invisible connection with a certain spot. The indescribable corruption was surging over. Ding! At the same time he flicked out a gold coin, he used Sapphira Castle's aura to cut off the connection and isolate the corruption. Immediately after, a clear image appeared in his mind. Klein grabbed the gold coin with his left hand. After the glove suddenly turned transparent, he instantly vanished from the room and appeared in a hall filled with bookshelves. On the side of the hall with floor-to-ceiling windows, there were many long rectangular tables. On one of them was a book bound by thin brass sheets. "I found you." A smile appeared on Klein's face. He made use of the brief connection to do a divination. Then, he relied on the attraction between Sphirot, to make the teleportation become abnormally precise. The law of convergence between Sphirot would allow Klein to accidentally enter the library and discover the brass book. However, it might have happened 2 days later, 2 weeks later, or even 2 years later. It wouldn't happen in time to stop anything. Furthermore, this was under the prerequisite that 0-02 didn't do any corresponding interference or avoidance measures. Pa! The clothes on Klein's back suddenly cracked as blood-red strokes appeared. This was a punishment for trespassing into a public area. Whipping. Thankfully, this crime is very light. And I won't be punished for this crime for the next 1 or 2 minutes. The rules will give the trespasser time to withdraw. Klein immediately reached out and grabbed a few times in the void. He didn't really pull out the figure of the ascetic leader, Ariana. This was because, to a non-committal person, historical projection was a form of fraud. He only used this method to send his location information to the servant of concealment. Due to the same reason, Klein dispersed the glove on his left hand. During this process, the brass book started flipping and displayed the rules. When one's rationality drops to 20% of its original value, there would be signs of losing control. Scholar of Yore has the ability to summon historical void projections. The success rate of summoning depends on the familiarity and friendliness of the target. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. One is not allowed to change the condition of the Trunsoist brass book in any way. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. The rules made Klein's eyelids twitch. He felt his rationality constantly dropping. This caused the primordial one's mental brand in his body to become more active. The first part of the rules is presented in grayish-black, as though it's in a state that can't be changed. This requires 0-02 to awaken further. If it awakens to the extent of changing the rules in front, it'll be very terrifying. It might even reduce the success rate of my summonings, causing Beyonders to show signs of losing control if their rationality falls a little. With this we've fixed the problem of this variant of a seer being too strong. As expected of 0-02. It fully lives up to its serial number. The text behind is presented in silver. Does this mean that the rules can be altered or enhanced? I can't touch it. I can't change its state. That also means that I can't take it away, nor can I directly conceal this sealed artifact. Perhaps I can use the Staff of the Stars or the Box of the Great Old Ones to directly move this library into the cosmos and let 0-02 face those outer deities. But if the outer deities were to grasp this sealed artifact, the problem might be greater than it is now. Klein hesitated for a moment and didn't risk summoning his Grade 0 sealed artifact. The next second, he heard a smacking sound. The figure of Ariana's simple linen robe and tree bark belt was quickly outlined at his side. She was lashed by an invisible whip, leaving behind an obvious bloody mark. The first problem has been resolved. Now, we need to consider the second problem. That is how to seal this fellow, Klein said as he made haste. It wouldn't be long before he would suffer a second punishment. Ariana shook her head. The corresponding information has been destroyed. We can only resolve it through trial and error. That's a little dangerous. We don't know, but someone definitely knows. Klein's heart stirred as he made his spirit body leave his body and enter the spirit world. Through the invisible barrier created by 0-02, he said to the Church of the God of Combat's chief shepherd, Larian, who was waiting for the curtain to disappear, perhaps we can make a deal. You want the method to seal 0-02? Larian turned around and chuckled. Do you think I'll agree? Actually, I'm very puzzled. Why must you sacrifice yourself for the fallen god of combat? By joining the Church of Evernight, you can still be an angel, and you can also receive blessings. You can also live for a very long time. Klein didn't directly respond as he said. Larian's expression darkened as he said, a mythical creature without any pious faith wouldn't be able to understand me. As an evil god, isn't it normal for me to not be devout? Klein couldn't help but mutter inwardly. This was his humanity. Chapter 1287 Guidance. Seeing that Klein was momentarily at a loss for words, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat, Larian, revealed a solemn expression. Furthermore, the fall of a deity is only temporary. He will eventually return and awaken using my body. Klein frowned slightly when he heard that. He didn't know whether the angel was having mental problems and wasn't far from losing control because of his shaken anchors, or if he was too affected by the god of combat. In a certain sense, he had become his backup. Ignoring the sequence 0 true deities, even kings of angels and a number of angels would often not completely die. You should know very well that the apocalypse will come in another 10 or so years. I believe that the speed of the god of combat's resurrection won't be fast enough. Klein attempted to awaken him with the cruel reality. Larian snorted. You will never be able to imagine the power of God. He didn't give Klein the chance to continue his persuasion and revealed a smile. In short, I won't make a deal with you. Pray to Evernight. Pray to the deity you believe in to seal 0-02 and save you. But all I need to do is wait another 30 to 40 seconds before I can leave this place. Klein looked up at the curtain hanging from infinitely high above and didn't say anything else. He made his spirit body return to the library where the Trunsoist brass book was. Do you have any ideas? He asked without any delay. Ariana shook her head slightly and asked, what did Larian say? He told us to pray to the deities to seal 0-02, as Klein spoke, he was suddenly stunned. What Larian said didn't seem to be problematic, but he had inadvertently revealed a very important piece of information. He believed that deities could seal 0-02, no matter who they were. Then, what does a deity rely on to seal it? By forcefully suppressing it with their sequence 0 status, or use a might that can destroy the world. Many questions appeared in Klein's mind. At this moment, Trunsoist brass book flipped to a blank page, producing silver words one after another. The language it used was the one on the first blasphemy slate. It seemed to be the source of all the languages that were still in use. In the blink of an eye, the silver words formed into new text. The Belton City Library is the place where the Trunsoist brass book is kept. It is a place that must be heavily protected. Living beings who intrude without the Trunsoist brass book's permission will be severely punished. It's an elevation of the punishment. I might be sentenced to death next. Klein's pupils dilated as he quickly deduced the most likely development. However, he didn't panic at all. Instead, he smiled and said with sincerity, my wish is to shrink the size of the Belton City Library, so that the spot where Ma'am Ariana and I are is the boundary line. As soon as he finished speaking, he snapped his fingers and granted his own wish. As the snapping sound reverberated, the lawn that corresponded to the Belton City Library disappeared. The building shrunk and the walls retreated. Soon, only a tenth of its original size was left. Klein and Ariana subconsciously arrived outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the open window, they stared at the Trunsoist brass book that remained on the rectangular table. There was no change in the distance between them and the target. They were still very close, but they were no longer within the confines of being severely punished. However, due to their first violation of the curfew, they were once again whipped by an invisible law enforcer. After accumulating the wishes of restoring buildings one after another, Klein could create quite a miracle in this aspect. He didn't make another wish and continued thinking. He analyzed the hidden meaning behind the words of the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat. No, it shouldn't have been forcefully suppressed using a deity's status and level. Otherwise, my spiritual intuition would have told me the answer long ago. That would have made me activate Sapphira Castle's aura and complete the seal. From a mysticism point of view, this is understandable. This is because 0-02 is clearly related to a particular Sapphira. It's difficult to suppress it by relying on the status and level of a sequence 0. By relying on the might of the deities themselves. This might be possible, but there's a high chance that it's not the real method. This is because Larian knows of a sealing method that can be completed without relying on the deities. What's special about a sequence 0 deity? And what methods can an angel use to achieve such a special sealing method? The most special thing that I can think of at the moment is that a sequence 0 deity contains a uniqueness. This is something I can't summon from the historical void. It really has the characteristic of being unique. But how can an angel indirectly simulate a uniqueness? Countless thoughts collided in Klein's mind, producing large amounts of sparks, but he still couldn't figure out the key to the problem. At this moment, the mercury-colored words on the Trunsoist brass book continued to seep out, forming new paragraphs that stipulated that Klein and Ariana were a group of people that needed punishment. Ariana observed silently for a while before suddenly saying, "I'll try to conceal the soil beneath the table to make 0-02 fall to the core. Raise your level of alertness to prevent any accidents. Conceal the soil. Fall to the core." Klein's heart stirred. He felt that this was a rather good solution. The Trunsoist brass book had only forbidden the touching and changing its condition at present. The environment wasn't equivalent to its condition. In addition, they were only forbidden from entering Belton City Library. It didn't mean that Klein and Ariana couldn't exert certain influences on it. And when 0-02, which hadn't been banned from leaving, passed through the concealed soil and fell to the core, it would lose its influence on Belton City due to the distance, causing the laws it had set up to fail. That was the case unless it was awakened further or came to life, allowing a larger region to fall under its jurisdiction. This way, Klein and Ariana no longer needed to be restricted by the rules. They could seek help from the Evernight goddess. However, when Ariana finally thought of a solution and was preparing to carry out the plan, a new law was completely formed: the Belton City Library, the place where the Trunsoist brass book is stored. It is a place that must be strictly protected. No living thing or object is to deal any form of damage to it in any way. Indeed, 0-02 has also noticed this loophole. This loophole. As Klein frowned slightly, he suddenly had an idea of what he had been thinking about. The uniqueness of a sequence 0 deity was indeed unique, but their sealing of 0-02 wasn't directly done by using the authority and power that came from it. It was very likely that they could rely on this trait of a uniqueness to lure 0-02 into setting up a series of contradictory rules, causing the sealed artifact to fall into a paradoxical cycle. In this aspect, angels, saints, and even ordinary people could accomplish that by themselves. The key was to think of paradox and guide it into establishing it. As for how to seal 0-02 after it entered a paradoxical cycle and was preparing to fix the loophole, Klein didn't have any clues at the moment, so he needed to make further observations. How should I create a paradox? All the rules and regulations set up by 0-02 quickly flashed through Klein's mind. In just a few seconds, he acutely grasped a point where he could create a paradoxical cycle. He quickly turned his head and said to Ariana, "Ma'am, let's not destroy the city library. We will directly conceal the other parts of the Belton, indirectly causing it to lose the necessary support. This place will then collapse on its own, thus, falling into the core." Ariana didn't immediately do as he said. Instead, she turned her head and gave Klein a deep look. "This will cause the deaths of many civilians. We have to make a choice between the lesser of two evils," Klein said seriously. Ariana didn't respond and fell silent. It was as though she was in an intense mental struggle or making the appropriate preparations. At this moment, the two brass pages that had just written the two articles quickly created more new rules. Belton is the city where the Trunsoist brass book is located, a true holy land in all senses of the phrase. No living thing or object is to deal any form of damage to it in any way. Upon seeing this text, Klein wasn't disappointed. Instead, he smiled. With a snap, he snapped his fingers, causing scarlet flames to surge out of his pocket and quickly drown him. In just 2 to 3 seconds, a stream of flames descended from the sky. Klein jumped out and carried a person. That was one of the 4 Beyonders he had saved previously. He was the Belton local, Biles. Go in and quickly flip through the brass book, Klein said calmly as he pointed at the 0-02 on the rectangular table. Biles didn't know exactly what had happened, but he believed that this magical magician, who had fulfilled 2 of his wishes, had found a way out of the situation plaguing Belton. Thus, after taking a deep breath, he entered the city library through the miniaturized, open floor-to-ceiling windows. During this process, he didn't receive any severe punishments. In fact, he wasn't even whipped. Upon seeing this scene, Klein's smile widened. 0-02 had produced a paradox. Due to a Rhodes's existence, the Trunsoist brass book could only do a most comprehensive prohibition, preventing any living being or object from dealing any form of damage to it in any way. As a city, Belton's definition didn't just include its terrain and buildings. It definitely included the residents here. This way, if 0-02 punished a Belton citizen like Biles, any damage to him would go against the law it had just issued. If it didn't punish him, it would go against the laws that prohibited him from entering the city library. Hence, the Trunsoist brass book had entered a vicious cycle. Of course, Klein believed that such a paradox would quickly be corrected by appending additional clauses. He only hoped that Biles would be able to flip through the brass book and find clues to sealing it. Pay attention to the currently open page. Once an article is about to take shape, immediately come out, Klein instructed as he stared at Biles and 0-02. Chapter 1288 Key Intelligence. Although Biles had witnessed Phil's severed hand, Weber's hanging, and Mr. Magician's palm fused from worms, and also had a certain understanding of the horrifying anomaly brought about by 0-02, his lacking level and experience made him unaware of the true horror behind this matter. He mostly explained it away as a horror tale coming to life. Therefore, despite feeling afraid, he mustered up his courage and quickly approached the rectangular table under the watch of the magical magician and grounded angel. Of course, him being from the sailor pathway was partly responsible. Within 2 or 3 steps, Biles had reached a spot where he could touch the brass book. Without thinking, he reached out his right palm and grabbed the brass pages on 0-02 and quickly flipped them. During this process, the back of Biles's hand held up the brass page, which hadn't completely been filled, to prevent it from being blocked, so as to allow him, Mr. Magician, and Ma'am Angel to observe the changes on it and react in advance. Amidst the flipping sounds, this sailor saw the line that touching the Trunsoist brass book would result in the death sentence. He was first alarmed before he was filled with a strong sense of puzzlement about his current state. However, this didn't affect his action of flipping the pages forward. Klein's eyes reflected the different brass pages, and each page had different rules. The projections of these brass pages didn't appear by making lines disappear and having new ones substitute them. Instead, they appeared side by side and gradually increased in number. In the end, Klein's eyes reflected a different number of brass pages in them. They were neatly arranged, one line after another. It was as though he had split the 0-02 into a single page and placed it on a glass platform to bask in the sun. This was a dream divination technique at the angel level, allowing Klein to reproduce the scenes he had just seen before his very eyes. With the passage of time, the brass pages in his dark brown eyes began to spin and pinpoint one of them. The Trunsoist brass book originates from a justiciar uniqueness that had been corrupted by the nation of disorder. It's exactly as I expected. Since the Trunsoist brass book can produce all the low-level rules, the corresponding content must contain a description of itself. This is determined by its essence. Unless it completely awakens or comes alive, and has the sufficient intelligence to know how to selectively hide it. Just as a thought of joy flashed through Klein's mind, he saw a new word in mercury color appear on the unfilled brass page. This meant that 0-02 had finally diverted a portion of its power from its vicious cycle. It was preparing to add text as a supplementary explanation to fix the flaws. Leave. Without any hesitation, Klein shouted. Biles strictly obeyed the orders of a high-leveled figure, immediately withdrawing his right hand, turning around, and sprinting out the window. Make a move to attack me. Seeing that the sailor with dual attributes had left the city library, Klein suddenly added. Biles's heart was filled with puzzlement, but he still raised his right arm and pulled back his shoulder. He put on a stance that looked like he was about to throw a punch at Klein. At this moment, a new article finally took shape with regards to the rules above. The Trunsoist Brass Book and the group of people it permits have immunity while enforcing the law. However, even if this article was successfully published, Biles wouldn't suffer any punishment. Clearly, the Trunsoist Brass Book wouldn't pursue problems that led to a vicious cycle or unclear definitions. It was just like how it didn't pile crimes on roads after it mended the loopholes in the rules. By the same logic, Biles, who had truly come into contact with 0-02, didn't suffer any contamination from a Sapphira. Before the supplementary clauses were published, Biles was a part of the Belton. He couldn't be damaged in any sense, so he couldn't be corrupted. But with the additional clause, he wouldn't be retroactively punished for his previous actions. In fact, after Biles left the city library, he had violated the curfew order as well, but Klein had already noticed a problem. It was that when the Belton citizens pursued foreigners while outside, they weren't restricted by the curfew. Therefore, he made Biles attack him in a manner to avoid the corresponding punishment. Right on the heels of that, he seized the opportunity while 0-02 was fixing the loophole to quickly recall the detailed information regarding the Trunsoist Brass Book. This book possesses a living characteristic, but most of the time, it's at a very low level. The first half of the book displays almost all the underlying rules, while the second half is blank. It needs to be filled in autonomously. Once there are no restrictions, it will naturally set up laws with certain biases for the surrounding areas and strictly enforce it. During this process, it will change and correct the rules based on the feedback. As the law gradually becomes stricter, his living characteristic will deepen. Once a law that can interfere with all aspects takes form, the Trunsoist Brass Book will completely come alive. It will possess true intelligence, and has the ability to modify the first half of the underlying rules to a certain extent. The exact extent that it can reach is as follows: if there are contradictions in the laws that can't be corrected, or if the pages are all filled without being able to form a sufficiently airtight system of rules, the Trunsoist Brass Book will produce a new line at the boundary between the first and second half. All the following rules are ineffective. After this line takes form, the rules in the second half will disappear and the pages will return to a blank slate. After the second half is completely blank, the clause, "all the following rules are ineffective," will be erased, and the Trunsoist Brass Book will repeat its previous actions until there is a set of laws that covers all aspects. The rules that it creates have to be publicized or informed to the masses before having them take effect. When there's no clear rule for a particular action, whether it's against the common knowledge of the surrounding living beings, Trunsoist Brass Book hates distorted and ugly rules. It hates having loopholes found. What a detailed description. There should be a method to seal 0-02 in all of this. Klein's thoughts raced as he attempted to find information that he could use from every line of text. At this moment, the leader of the ascetics, Ariana, whispered, "Think of a way to fill the pages behind 0-02, without making it airtight enough." That's right. In that case, the Trunsoist Brass Book will declare that all the following rules are ineffective. It'll redo it again. When that happens, its restrictions on the surroundings will temporarily vanish, allowing us to have the chance to touch it, take it away, or directly pray to a deity. But, how should we go about doing this? The Trunsoist Brass Book hates distorted and ugly rules. It hates having loopholes found. Klein's heart stirred as he had an idea. Without any hesitation, he stretched out his arms, as if he was hugging the air. In the next second, inside the building whose dimensions had shrunk to 1/10 of the original Belton City Library, a hall that was covered with deep black stone slabs with all kinds of scuffing descended into the real world. There were 8 black stone pillars erected in the hall, and metal poles hung from the high dome. At the bottom were candlesticks carved into different creatures, 41 on the left and 40 on the right. This was the Tudor Trunsoist United Empire's Hall of Consuls that Klein had seen before. At that time, both consuls were still Sequence 1 Princes of Abolition of the Black Emperor pathway, so this place was filled with distortions. It didn't match the normal circumstances and didn't have any rules of aesthetics. Apart from that, when Klein summoned this historical scene, he also used his domain's ability to add the details of the fourth epoch which he knew. It made the order that stemmed from the Black Emperor become more and more detailed, as though it was corporeal. Pa! His wrists were severed as they landed on the ground. Blood spurted out from the wound, just like an ordinary person. This was the second time Klein had committed fraud. The 2 palms and fresh blood that gushed to the ground quickly separated into transparent maggots and sticky, nearly shapeless liquid. As the worms of spirit convulsed and died, Klein grimaced due to the pain as he made numerous worms crawl out from the stump to form new palms. At the same time, he tried his best to maintain the scene he had created through multiple summonings, not letting it dissipate. On the rectangular table, inside the book that had bound brass pages, many new lines of text appeared. All buildings and structures have to follow the golden ratio and principles of symmetry. Strange clothes are not permitted. The following crimes have the death penalty. The Trunsoist brass book flipped through the pages quickly as it targeted the laws that stemmed from a black emperor. The further it went, the faster the new text appeared. There were no more pauses that lasted nearly a minute. Inside the hall, the candlesticks that fell from the ceiling broke and disappeared. Then, the other parts of the hall experienced various changes, wiping away the original details of the order one by one. Finally, the hall could no longer be maintained. It collapsed and returned to the historical void. At that moment, the Trunsoist brass book had already flipped to the last 2 pages. It was spread out there without any movement. With the last page filled with text and no longer able to form a tight system of rules with what 0-02 had previously set, Klein silently exhaled and relaxed a little. He felt that his spirituality was almost depleted. Let's wait for an hour at Byles's house. He turned his head and said to Ariana. If they stayed where they were, they would suffer increasingly severe punishments from breaking the curfew until they were sentenced to death. As for monitoring the Trunsoist brass book, this mission that couldn't allow for mistakes was naturally handed over to a Rhodes. Although this magic mirror couldn't directly look at 0-02, it could pay attention to the notice board and determine the disappearance progress of the laws on it. Chapter 1289 Fooling. After returning to Byles's house, Klein pulled a chair over and sat down without waiting for Roy and company to make inquiries. He made a rather pious wish. I wish for my spirituality to be restored. With that said, he raised his right hand, snapped his fingers, and granted his own wish, thus, allowing his spirituality to return to its normal state. Right on the heels of that, he extended his left palm, preparing to end the maintenance of the historical projection of the curtain before summoning a new one, so as to continue sealing off the spirit world area corresponding to Belton City. This prevented the Church of the God of Combat's chief shepherd, Larian, from escaping. There's no need to do so. There's always a next time. At that moment, Ariana slowly shook her head, indicating that Klein no longer needed to summon the curtain that originated from the dark demonic wolf. There was a limit to the power of wishes. A miracle invoker couldn't satisfy the same wish in a short period of time, which meant that, within the next 1 or 2 hours, Klein couldn't recover his spirituality by granting his own wishes. Of course, to a qualified seer pathway angel, this limitation was something that could be avoided. For example, he could get Pasha, Roy, Byles, and Ariana to take turns to wish for Klein to regain his spirituality before granting their wishes as a miracle invoker. However, the problem was that, even if he could recover his spirituality that many times, he wouldn't be able to maintain the curtain, which was at the level of a sequence 1 for more than an hour. Furthermore, he needed to wait an hour before 0-02 erased all the previous rules and rewrote them. After some deliberation, Klein nodded slightly and replied with a smile, let's give it a try first. After all, we're rather free right now. I'll give up after my last spirituality recovery attempt. Yes, this will purely depend on the chief shepherd's luck. Perhaps he might lose control because of anxiety, frustration, and nervousness. As he spoke, Klein dispelled the maintenance of the original curtain, and his left hand moved forward immediately after that. He pulled out a new curtain, allowing it to appear inside the spirit world that corresponded to Belton City. In an area where saturated colors overlapped one another, Larian, who was wearing a black robe with white edges and a square hat, felt the restriction disappear. Just as he was about to make his way out, he saw a new curtain descend, sealing him off again. The smile on his face instantly froze. Phew. A few seconds later, Larian slowly exhaled and composed himself mentally as he continued to wait. In the next hour, the chief shepherd of the Church of the God of Combat repeatedly experienced the despair and pain of having his hopes extinguished. He attempted to find the pattern and attempt to figure out the time interval so as to grasp the fleeting opportunity. He wanted to rush out of the barrier the moment the old curtain disappeared and before the new curtain was produced. However, he eventually discovered that the intervals didn't follow any pattern. The person stopping him didn't restore the barrier only when his spirituality was about to be depleted. At times, the other party would recreate the barrier far ahead of time. If it wasn't for the fact that Phasacian citizens weren't forced to change faiths from the God of Combat, and that the decree that Larian was considered a traitor hadn't been widely spread, this grounded angel might have already lost control on the spot. As time passed, Larian once again sensed the collapse of the old curtain. However, this time, there was no new curtain. He has finally reached his limit. Larian was delighted. Without any hesitation, he rushed out of the collapsing nascent divine kingdom. In the next moment, he saw a woman holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads, dressed in a complicated long dress, an unknown existence that was wrapped in bandages with yellowish-brown liquid covering the entire, and several strange but abnormally powerful spirit world creatures. The curtain that Klein had summoned the previous times were historical void projections that had been tainted with Sapphira Castle's aura. It naturally attracted objects sensitive to it. He wouldn't even be surprised if Amon was among the group. The smile on Larian's face froze again. Belton City, in Biles's rental apartment. Klein suddenly raised his head and looked up into the sky. He muttered softly, "Impressive." Following that, he became silent again until the magic mirror emitted an aqueous light that reflected the noticeboard's current state. The rules on the paper disappeared in reverse order of their appearance. This meant that 0-02 was beginning to erase the rules that it had set up, and was preparing to redo everything. Once the curfew order was abolished, the highly focused Klein immediately pulled Ma'am Ariana and used Flaming Jump to appear outside the shrunken Belton City Library. As he looked over, he realized that, on the brass pages of 0-02, the speed at which the rules were being wiped clear had become very fast. In just a blink of an eye, the second half of the book was only left with the clause, "All the following rules are ineffective." Following that, the clause disappeared as a new set of rules rapidly emerged without any gaps. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Before this clause was completed, Ariana's figure had already appeared beside the rectangular table. Her finger touched the brass page. With a crack, the leader of the Church of Evernights ascetic had her neck suddenly constricted as though an invisible rope had hoisted her up. As an angel, she had actually suffered bone fractures and had difficulties breathing. Death by hanging. However, with Ariana's finger sliding over with some difficulty, the first clause that appeared was erased before it was fully displayed. It entered a concealed state. As for all the rules set by 0-02, it had to be publicized or announced before it could truly be effective. With a whoosh, Ariana picked up the Trunsoist brass book and threw it to Klein, who was outside the window. In the previous hour, Klein had already anticipated all the possible developments and had a discussion with Ariana. He was in no way nervous or flustered. While 0-02 was still in midair, he dragged another himself wearing a human-skinned glove out of the void. Then, he grabbed the Trunsoist brass book and used his historical projection to teleport away. After his figure disappeared from his spot, Ariana landed on the ground with a loud thud, a deep mark left on her neck. In just a few seconds, Klein, who was holding 0-02, appeared at the top of the main peak of the Hornaces mountain range. He used his spirit vision at the level of an angel and saw the collapsed, dilapidated, and fogged palace. Without any hesitation, Klein allowed his historical projection to take the Trunsoist brass book and, blink, to the main door of the palace before pushing the door open. What appeared before him was a hall with many corpses hanging from above. Every corpse was different. There were men and women either dressed beautifully, simply, exquisitely, or casually. Behind each of these hangers was a transparent and slippery tentacle with complicated patterns. They came from the depths of the hall, from that ancient stone chair. On the huge stone chair, transparent and distorted maggots were formed into a ball. They grew wantonly and extended out strange tentacles. This was the half-fool of the Antigonus family, who had lost control and gone mad. Sensing the door open, and sensing Klein's historical projection approach, the cluster of maggots left the stone chair and fiercely flailed their slippery tentacles, causing them to surge towards the door as if they were being affected by an invisible suction force. Similarly, at the bottom of the stone chair, the tarot card with Roselle's image, which was written with a stellar radiance, flew towards the door. Just seeing this scene pushed Klein's historical projection towards experiencing a breakdown. Thankfully, he didn't possess any sentience and was remotely controlled by Klein. He didn't suffer the chaotic thoughts and the negative side effects of the mental mutation, nor did he stand motionless and helpless. Before the historical projection dissipated, it threw the Trunsoist brass book at the terrifying cluster of maggots. The transparent and slippery tentacles sensed danger and instinctively reacted by wrapping around sealed artifact 0-02. Under such interference and the invisible strong winds, the Fool card had reached the door one step ahead of the strange tentacles. Klein's historical projection had mostly collapsed. Seeing this, he mechanically extended his right hand, grabbed the card of blasphemy, and threw it behind him. In the next instant, the slippery tentacles that were reassembled had reached out to the door, but they were blocked by the fog, unable to exit. All it could do was wildly pound at the barrier. The open door slowly closed, blocking out this scene. Klein, who was hiding somewhere on the mountain peak, frowned slightly. He felt a sense of joy and relief, as well as a strong sense of doubt. In other words, I used 0-02 to exchange for the Fool's card. The goddess doesn't need me to seek clues regarding the river of eternal darkness for the time being. Klein silently muttered to himself. He walked out of the hidden area and arrived not far from the ancient palace. He bent down and picked up the card of blasphemy. On the surface of the card was Roselle Gustave, who was wearing colorful clothes and holding a stick and luggage. His eyes were filled with a longing for the future, and behind him was a puppy. On the upper left corner of the card, the resplendent stellar radiance outlined a few words, Sequence 0, the Fool. Inside the ancient palace, the Trunsoist brass book fell to the ground and opened up to the first page of the second half of the book. New rules began to form. The Trunsoist brass book is the most precious item. No living being is permitted to touch it. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. One is not allowed to change the condition of the Trunsoist brass book in any way. Those in violation are to be sentenced to death. Just as the two rules just appeared, and before it could inform the owner here, a line of words suddenly appeared between the two halves of the book. All the following rules are ineffective. An hour later, the two rules were wiped out, and new rules were written. However, after just 2 lines, there was an additional clause in front of them. 0-02 seemed to have reached a blank slate that happened when the entire book was filled up. Again and again, the Trunsoist brass book fell into an endless cycle. Chapter 1290 Fulfilling Wishes. Putting away the Fool card. Klein took out Creeping Hunger from the void, equipped it to his left hand, and activated Teleport. After returning to the miniaturized city library, he immediately said to the servant of concealment, Ariana, it has been thrown into the abandoned palace on the main peak of the Hornacis mountain range. That was an entrance to the foggy town. As for how to deal with 0-02 later on, it was the Church of Evernight's problem. All right. Ariana nodded and didn't say anything else. She entered a concealed state and vanished as though she had been erased. She didn't thank him, nor mention any payment. It was just like how she had never made any requests when she helped Klein in the past. Does Ma'am Ariana know that I've obtained the Fool card? Klein looked around thoughtfully and slowly sighed in the darkness. Although the supernatural incident had been resolved in less than 2 hours, there were still quite a number of people who had lost their lives under the strict rules. The Belton citizens had more or less committed certain mistakes, but the punishments they suffered were far more disproportionate to the crimes they had committed. The most innocent party in the matter were the tourists who came or passed by Belton. They had to face a nightmare simply because they were foreigners. Klein had tried his best to do some things to protect many outsiders, including Roy and the others, but he was also limited in what he could do due to the restrictions he suffered. There weren't many loopholes that could be made use of, making it impossible to make it seem like none of that had ever happened. What I need to do next is to mainly provide treatment to the survivors. Klein retracted his gaze and planned on teleporting to Biles's house to deal with the remaining problems. At that moment, Rionette Tynker, who was holding 4 blonde, red-eyed heads and was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out of the void. One of the heads bit onto a black goat's horn. He escaped the spirit world, the remaining 3 heads of Miss Messenger said. As expected of a former chief shepherd. Klein, who had long sensed it, sighed without any surprise. Then, he pointed at the black goat's horn. Did Larian leave that behind? After Klein received the item, Rionette Tynker's head that hadn't spoken earlier said, yes. After encountering the curse of deformity, he had still managed to barge out of the encirclement and escape from the spirit world. He is indeed powerful. Is this a Sequence 2 angel who's best at fighting head-on? Klein flicked his wrist, causing the black goat horn in his palm to shatter into countless tiny specks of light as it dissipated, dispersing the remnant psyche. The limbs left behind by a Beyonder after them undergoing a transformation, contain a portion of their Beyonder characteristics that couldn't return to the main body. When the points of light were reassembled from Sequence 9 to Sequence 7, as well as a Sequence 4 Beyonder characteristic, Klein chose the Sequence 8 Pugilist from it and returned the rest to Miss Messenger with a smile. These are your spoils. I'll only collect the intelligence fee. Rionette Tynker didn't stand on ceremony. She raised one of the blonde, red-eyed heads and had it open its mouth, absorbing the Sequence 9, Sequence 7, and Sequence 4 Warrior Beyonder characteristics. After watching Miss Messenger leave Belton, Klein teleported back to Biles's home and smiled at Roy and company. The problem has been resolved. You are no longer foreigners who have to be treated with animosity. The 4 Beyonders were just about to respond with heartfelt and relieved smiles when they saw the magical Mr. Magician invite a stranger from the air. It was an old man with a dark red bow tie. He wore a shirt, vest, formal suit, and blue striped trousers. His hair remained thick despite it being all white. His aura was warm and elegant. This was the marionette, Vin Rambus, whom Klein had once possessed. He planned on using this manipulator to seal away their memories of 0-02. Not being corrupted by a Sapphira didn't mean that Biles wouldn't encounter terrifying matters when he recollected the matter. As there was only one relevant period of memory for Biles, and he didn't know the truth of the matter, what Klein needed to do was rather simple. Therefore, he didn't seek Miss Justice's help. He planned on using his marionette's historical void projection to complete it. You didn't tell them about what happened in the city library, right? Klein got Vin Rambus to walk to his side as he asked Biles. Biles hurriedly shook his head and said, I remember your advice. Very good. Next, I'll give you some psychological treatment. I'll help you forget all those matters. Otherwise, you'll be targeted by 0-02 and never be able to obtain peace until you die. Believe me, sealed artifacts at this level can definitely do something like that, even if it has been taken away. Klein explained his goal frankly. Biles's lips quivered as he said, all right. He chose to obey and believe. After inviting Roy, Pasha, and Phil out of this rental apartment, Klein controlled Vin Rambis to do a series of mental control processes and successfully made Biles forget the brass book he had seen, as well as the contents on it. After doing this, Klein carefully took out the magic mirror and looked at it. Erodes, are there any other hidden dangers? On the surface of the ancient silver mirror, the aqueous light flickered and reflected a line of silver words, Great Master, there aren't any latent risks in Belton. As for other places in Lone and Faysac, as it involves 0-02 itself, I'm unable to see it clearly. Perhaps you can confirm it yourself? All right. Klein nodded slightly, took out a gold coin, and softly chanted the corresponding divination statement. With a ping, the gold coin flicked up and tumbled in the air. During this process, scenes naturally surfaced in Klein's mind. They were chimneys, streets, and cities. They were extremely vague and lacked specific directions. With a slight frown, he collected his thoughts and reached out to catch the gold coin. Then, he got Pasha and the others to return to Biles's home. He smiled and said to Roy, didn't you wish to obtain the next potion? You can make a wish now. Roy's eyes revealed surprise and he asked nervously, I can still make another wish. This is a gift, Klein replied with a smile. Roy's heart stirred. Without asking any more questions, he seized this opportunity to fulfill his wish of obtaining the next potion. Klein then threw the Warrior Pathways Sequence 8 Pugilist Beyonder characteristic to him. This is essentially a potion, but for safety, I suggest you search for the corresponding formula and find the correct supplementary ingredients. Your amazing feats are worthy of praise. Roy expressed his gratitude. His first potion had, in some sense, been a Warrior Beyonder characteristic that he devoured. As the apocalypse was approaching, along with his relatively low sequence and good luck, he didn't lose control on the spot. He didn't even have any serious psychological problems. After that, he gradually came into contact with other Beyonders and came into contact with true mysticism. Only then did he learn how dangerous his actions were, and he didn't dare make a similar attempt again. Faced with Roy's praise, Klein looked around and smiled. Next, follow me out of Belton. This doesn't mean that there's still danger here, but I have to make use of this time to fulfill your wishes. One wish involved Roy hoping that Klein could help them leave the Belton, while the other wish involved Pasha's wish to have Klein protect them and allow them to leave Belton City alive. Although these two matters were meaningless under the present situation, to Klein, he had to fulfill the wish even if there was no point in doing it. I'm just a heartless, wish-granting machine. Klein lampooned himself as he smiled at Biles and company. Pasha and the others glanced at each other, not daring to raise any objections. Just like before, they held each other's hands. Then, Klein brought them to the outskirts of Belton with teleportation. The magic show has come to an end. It's time to say goodbye. Klein took off his hat and bowed. He tried his best to make himself a true wandering magician. This was a habit of his acting. Upon seeing this, Pasha blurted out, "Can we know your name?" Klein smiled and said, "I have too many names. Different people have different names for me. You can call me the Miracle Magician, Merlin Hermes." "Mr. Hermes, are you a believer of the Evernight Goddess?" Roy asked after some hesitation. For a moment, Klein didn't know how to answer. He really wanted to say that he once was, but not anymore. After some consideration, he decided to act as an attendant of mysteries in advance. He immediately restrained his smile and solemnly said, "The one I serve is the Fool, the Lord of the Mysteries, the great ruler above the spirit world. If you wish to believe in this mighty existence, or wish to gain more of an understanding, you can go to the Sonia Sea's Rorsted archipelago. The Lord's missionary, Danitz, is currently preaching there. Furthermore, the City of Silver definitely has all the potion formulas from the warrior pathway under sequence 2. Klein silently added, but he didn't say it out loud. Roy nodded slightly and said, "It's my first time knowing of such a mighty existence in this world. Your miraculous nature has shown his brilliance." He didn't directly respond to Mr. Merlin Hermes because he was still hesitant. Pasha, Biles, and Phil were the same. Without another word, Klein turned around and left the four Beyonders, before making a detour to Belton. He didn't forget his purpose in alighting at this tiny city. He planned on immediately finding a room to study the Fool card above the grey fog. In a city in mid-seashore, at a particular library. A young law researcher took out a book from the bookshelf and walked to a table by the window and sat down. As he carefully read through the book, he realized that there was a page of yellowish-brown paper in it. "What is this?" the young law researcher muttered to himself in confusion and reached out to pull out the paper. After confirming that it was written in ancient Faisak, the content was rather rare. In the fourth epoch, there was a book named the Trunsoist Brass Book.